One stormy winter night in the wilds of Montana, a lonely lumberjack makes a choice that will change the course of two lives forever. But the reason behind his decision isn't what anyone in town expected. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. In the harsh winter of 1889, Jacob Miller stood alone in his cabin nestled deep within the dense pine forests of northern Montana. The crackling fire barely kept the biting cold at bay as he stared out the frost-covered window at the endless white landscape. 10 years of solitude had hardened the lumberjack's features, his once bright eyes now as weathered as the surrounding mountain ranges. "Another day," he muttered to himself, running calloused fingers through his thick brown beard. The isolation was his choice after losing Sarah and their unborn child to fever. The wilderness had become both his refuge and his prison. Jacob pulled on his heavy wool coat and worn leather boots. The lumber camp 20 miles south needed his services, and the journey would take most of the day. He hitched his horse, Thunder, to the simple wooden sled loaded with tools. As he traveled, snowflakes began to fall, dancing in the wind that whipped through the pines. The familiar route normally brought him comfort, but today something felt different. A strange uneasiness settled in his chest. By midday, Jacob reached Pinewood, a small settlement that had sprung up around the lumber operation. Men bustled about, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The foreman, Bill Harrison, waved him over. "Miller, good to see you made it through that weather," Bill called out, his voice booming across the yard. Jacob nodded. "Storm's getting worse. Won't be able to stay long." "Well, we appreciate the extra hands. The orders from back east have doubled. Railroads are expanding faster than we can supply the timber." As Jacob worked alongside the other men, the conversation inevitably turned to plans for the evening. "Heading to Rosie's place after work, Miller?" asked a young lumberjack named Thomas. "New girl arrived last week. They say she's from back east. Real proper lady who fell on hard times." Jacob merely grunted, focusing on his axe as it bit into the pine. He hadn't visited Rosie's establishment, the only brothel in Pinewood, in years. Such comfort seemed hollow after Sarah. When dusk fell, the men collected their pay. Bill handed Jacob $5, extra for coming out in this weather. "Why don't you treat yourself tonight? Can't be healthy, man living alone like you do." Jacob pocketed the money with a nod. The storm had intensified, snow falling in thick curtains. The thought of the treacherous journey back to his cabin made him hesitate. "Got a room available if you need it," Bill offered, reading his thoughts. "I'll consider it," Jacob replied. Instead of heading straight back, Jacob found himself pushing through the doors of the town's only saloon. The warmth and noise hit him like a wall after the silent forest. Men laughed and played cards while a piano jangled in the corner. Jacob ordered whiskey and sat alone, watching the scene with detached interest. That's when he saw her. She sat alone at a small table, her posture rigid despite her worn dress. Her face, though beautiful, carried a profound sadness that resonated with something deep inside him. This must be the woman Thomas mentioned. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away, a flush spreading across her pale cheeks. Jacob noticed how the other men glanced at her, some with pity, others with less noble intentions. When a drunk miner approached her table and began making crude propositions, Jacob surprised himself by standing up. Before he knew what he was doing, he had crossed the room. "The lady doesn't seem interested," he said quietly. The miner turned, ready to argue, but something in Jacob's steady gaze made him reconsider. He mumbled a curse and retreated to the bar. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft with an accent he couldn't place. "Though I don't need saving. It's part of my arrangement." Jacob nodded awkwardly, suddenly aware of his intrusion. "My apologies, Miss ... double quotes. Catherine," she supplied. "Catherine Winters. Jacob Miller." He hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat down, uncomfortably aware of his rough appearance and the mud on his boots. "You're not from around here," he observed. "Boston," she replied, a shadow crossing her face. "Life there became untenable after my husband's death." Jacob's eyes flickered to her hands, noticing the pale band on her finger where a wedding ring had once been. "I understand loss," he said simply. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared pain that needed no elaboration. "Would you ... Catherine hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her glass. "Would you like to go somewhere more private? I believe that's why most men approach me here." The question caught Jacob off guard. "I didn't come over with that intention." "Yet you have $5 in your pocket that wasn't there this morning," she said, her perception surprising him. "And I have a room upstairs where I'm expected to earn my keep." Jacob felt a strange discomfort. This wasn't what he wanted, yet he couldn't bear the thought of leaving her to the mercy of the rougher men in the saloon. "I'll pay for your time," he finally said, pulling out the $5. "But all I want is conversation." Catherine studied him, skepticism and hope battling in her eyes. "Just conversation?" "Just conversation," Jacob confirmed, placing the money on the table. She took it with a barely visible tremor in her slender fingers. "Please follow me, Mr. Miller." As they climbed the narrow stairs, Jacob heard whispers and chuckles from the men below. Catherine led him to a small room at the end of the hallway. Inside was a simple bed, a washstand, and a chair. A small fire in the grate provided the only warmth. Catherine closed the door and turned to him with resignation in her eyes. "Please ... just make it quick." Jacob removed his hat but remained standing by the door. "I meant what I said. I only want to talk." Confusion crossed her face. "Talk? About what?" "Anything. Boston. The weather. Books you've read." "I haven't had a proper conversation in years." She stared at him for a long moment before her shoulders relaxed slightly. "You're a strange man, Mr. Miller. So I've been told." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. And so they talked, awkwardly at first, then with growing ease as the howling storm outside trapped them in their unexpected sanctuary. The night deepened as Jacob and Catherine continued their conversation. The small fire cast dancing shadows across the room while the blizzard raged outside, effectively cutting them off from the rest of the world. It created an unexpected intimacy between two strangers bound by nothing more than circumstance and shared loneliness. "How did you end up here?" Jacob asked, now seated in the room's only chair while Catherine perched on the edge of the bed. "Boston to Montana is quite a journey for anyone, especially a woman alone." Catherine's hands twisted in her lap. "After Robert, my husband, died, I discovered he had gambled away everything we owned. I was left with nothing but debts." Her voice grew quieter. "His creditors were ... insistent. I fled west with what little I could carry, and somehow ended up in Pinewood," Jacob observed. "The train fare ran out in Helena. A man there told me about work opportunities here. He neglected to mention exactly what kind of work would be available to a woman with no family and no references." A bitter smile crossed her face. "I arrived last week. Rosie offered me a place to stay and food in exchange for ... services." Jacob's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes softened. "First time? Is it that obvious?" She gave a small, humorless laugh. "You're my first ... client, though I suppose you're not really a client at all, given our arrangement." "I'm sorry," he said simply. Catherine looked up, surprised. "For what?" "That life has been unkind to you. That you had to come to a place like this." She studied him for a moment. "What about you, Mr. Miller? What drove you to live alone in the wilderness?" Jacob shifted uncomfortably. He rarely spoke of his past, yet something about Catherine's direct gaze made the words come easier than expected. "I had a wife, Sarah." The name felt strange on his tongue after so long. "And a child on the way." Catherine's expression softened with understanding. "What happened?" "Fever took them both. 10 years ago now." Jacob stared into the fire. "I couldn't bear to stay in town after that." Every face, every pitying look was a reminder. "So I built a cabin in the North Woods where the only company is pine trees and wildlife." "And you've been alone all this time?" "Seems that way." Jacob rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "Never thought much about it until tonight." A comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal. "I should check on the weather," Jacob said, rising from his chair. He moved to the small window and wiped away the frost. Beyond the glass was nothing but swirling white. "Storm's worse. Won't be traveling back tonight." Catherine joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent in her hair. It's beautiful in its way. Terrifying but beautiful. Like many things in these mountains, Jacob agreed. Their reflections stared back at them in the glass, a strange pair indeed. The rugged lumberjack and the genteel Boston widow, both exiles from their former lives. You said you had a cabin, Catherine said suddenly. What's it like? Jacob described his simple home, the sturdy pine walls, the stone fireplace he'd built with his own hands, the view of the mountains from his porch. As he spoke, he realized how seldom he appreciated these things anymore. It sounds peaceful, Catherine said wistfully. It is, lonely sometimes, but peaceful. I've forgotten what peace feels like, she admitted. Jacob turned to her, studying her face in the firelight. Despite the hardship evident in her eyes, there was a resilience there that impressed him. What will you do? He asked. Stay here at Rosie's? Catherine's gaze dropped. I don't have many options. At least here I have shelter and food. But at what cost? We all pay for survival somehow, Mr. Miller. Her voice hardened slightly. You retreat to the wilderness. I do what I must. Jacob nodded, understanding her defensiveness. I didn't mean to judge. No, I apologize, Catherine sighed. This isn't what I envisioned for my life. I was educated, you know. I can read Latin and Greek. I played the piano at social gatherings. And now, life has a way of taking unexpected turns, Jacob said. Indeed it does. She managed a small smile. Would you like some tea? Rosie allows us to keep a kettle. As Catherine prepared the tea with practiced movements, Jacob found himself studying her more carefully. Despite her circumstances, she maintained a dignity that spoke of her upbringing. Her hands, though beginning to roughen from work, still moved with a grace that seemed out of place in this rough frontier town. Do you have any family back east? He asked as she handed him a chipped cup. Catherine shook her head. My parents died years ago. No siblings. Robert was my only family. She paused. What about you? A brother in Pennsylvania. We exchanged letters at Christmas, but not much else. They sipped their tea as the night grew deeper. The sounds from the saloon below had quieted as the patrons either left for home or found themselves snowbound at Rosie's establishment. Do you ever regret it? Catherine asked suddenly, choosing solitude. Jacob considered the question seriously. Sometimes. On the coldest nights or when illness strikes. But mostly no. The forest asks nothing of me but respect. I envy that freedom, she said quietly. It's not freedom exactly, Jacob replied. More like a different kind of prison, one of my own making. Catherine's response was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Heavy footsteps approached, followed by a pounding on the door. Catherine! A woman's voice called out. Everything all right in there? Man's been awful quiet. That's Rosie, Catherine whispered to Jacob. Then, louder. Everything's fine, Rosie. Mr. Miller is a gentleman. There was a pause. Well, his time's nearly up unless he's paying for the whole night. Got others waiting. Jacob stood, suddenly aware of the reality of their situation. This wasn't a social call. He had purchased Catherine's time, however differently they had spent it. I should go, he said, reaching for his coat. Where will you stay? Catherine asked, concern in her voice. The storm. Bill offered a room at the bunkhouse. I'll manage. She nodded, an unexpected disappointment crossing her face. Thank you for the conversation, Mr. Miller. It was a kindness I didn't expect. Jacob hesitated at the door, feeling as though something important remained unsaid. Perhaps I could call on you again? For conversation only, of course. A genuine smile, the first he'd seen, brightened her face. I'd like that. As Jacob stepped into the hallway, he found Rosie waiting, arms crossed over her ample bosom, suspicion clear in her shrewd eyes. You didn't touch her, she stated, not a question. No, ma'am, Rosie studied him. Peculiar man. $5 for talking. Jacob said nothing, merely nodded as he passed her. She's not cut out for this life, Rosie called after him, her voice surprisingly gentle. Too soft. Won't last the winter. The words followed Jacob as he made his way through the now quiet saloon and into the stormy night, weighing on him more heavily than he cared to admit. The blizzard lasted 3 days. blanketing pine wood in several feet of snow and effectively cutting off the small settlement from the outside world. Jacob remained at the lumber camp, sleeping in the crowded bunkhouse and working alongside the other men to clear paths between buildings. All the while, his thoughts kept returning to Catherine and their unusual evening together. On the fourth morning, the sun finally emerged, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a blinding expanse of white. Jacob knew he should return to his cabin. There would be repairs needed after such a storm, yet he found himself hesitating. "Thinking of heading back today?" Bill asked as they shared coffee in the mess hall. "Should," Jacob replied, staring into his tin cup. "Cabin needs checking." Bill studied him with knowing eyes. "Heard you spent some time with the new girl at Rosie's." Jacob's head snapped up. "It wasn't what you think." "None of my business what it was," Bill shrugged. "Just noticed you seemed different, less haunted maybe." Jacob considered this. He did feel different, though he couldn't articulate exactly how. "I should check on her before I leave," he said finally. "Make sure she's faring well after the storm." Bill nodded, a hint of a smile beneath his mustache. "Supply wagon's heading to town in an hour if you want a ride." Later that morning, Jacob found himself once again outside Rosie's establishment. In daylight, the two-story building looked even more worn and dreary than it had in the evening. He hesitated at the door, suddenly unsure of his purpose there. Before he could decide whether to knock or leave, the door swung open. Rosie herself stood there, her hair hastily pinned up, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd had little sleep. "Mr. Miller," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Wasn't expecting to see you in daylight hours." "I came to check on Miss Winters," Jacob said, removing his hat. "Is she available?" Rosie's expression changed subtly. "She's indisposed at present." Something in her tone alarmed him. "Is she ill?" Rosie hesitated, then sighed heavily. "Come in. It's too cold for doorway conversations." Jacob followed her into the parlor, empty at this hour save for a young woman sweeping the floor. The place smelled of stale smoke and cheap perfume. "Catherine's not well," Rosie admitted once they were seated. "The cold got to her lungs. She's been feverish since yesterday." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Fever had taken Sarah, and the memory of her decline was still painfully vivid even after a decade. "Have you sent for the doctor?" he asked. Rosie snorted. "Doc Jenkins won't come here unless one of us is dying, and even then, he charges double. Besides, the roads to Helena are still blocked." "I want to see her," Jacob said firmly. Rosie studied him, curiosity and wariness battling in her expression. "You paid good money to not touch her the other night. Now you're worried for her health? What's your interest in Catherine exactly?" Jacob met her gaze directly. "I'm not entirely sure myself." After a moment, Rosie nodded. "Up the stairs, last door on the right, same room as before. But she's weak, so don't expect much conversation this time." Jacob climbed the narrow staircase, his heart inexplicably pounding. When he knocked softly on Catherine's door, there was no response. He knocked again, then carefully pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn against the bright snowlight outside. Catherine lay in bed, her face flushed with fever, her breathing labored. A basin of water sat on the nightstand beside a cloth. "Catherine?" he called softly. Her eyes fluttered open, taking a moment to focus on him. "Mr. Miller," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see how you were before heading back to my cabin," he said, approaching the bed. "Rosie told me you were unwell." Catherine attempted to sit up but fell back against the pillows. "It's nothing serious, just a chill." Jacob placed a hand on her forehead, alarmed at the heat radiating from her skin. "This is more than a chill." He dipped the cloth in the water and gently placed it on her forehead. Catherine closed her eyes at the cooling sensation. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured. "I'm not fit company." "I've nursed sick horses through worse," Jacob said, attempting levity. "At least you're not likely to kick me." A weak smile touched her lips. "No promises." Jacob pulled the room's only chair beside the bed and sat down. "I'll stay for a while, if you don't mind." "Rosie won't like it. You're not paying for this time." "Let me worry about Rosie." Catherine studied him through fever-glazed eyes. "Why are you being kind to me?" The question caught Jacob off guard. Why indeed? He barely knew this woman, yet here he was, postponing his return home to sit in her sickbed. Perhaps because kindness has been in short supply for both of us, he finally answered. She seemed to accept this, her eyes drifting closed as exhaustion claimed her. Jacob continued to dampen the cloth and place it on her forehead, watching the rise and fall of her chest with growing concern. Her breathing was too shallow, too rapid. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when Rosie appeared at the door. She's getting worse, she stated flatly. Jacob nodded. She needs medicine. Proper care. Like I said, Doc won't come here. Then I'll take her to him, Jacob decided suddenly. Rosie raised an eyebrow. And how do you propose to do that? Roads are barely passable. My sled, it can handle the snow. And what then? You'll bring her back here once she's better? The question gave Jacob pause. He hadn't thought beyond getting Catherine the help she needed. I don't know, he admitted. Rosie sighed heavily. Listen, Miller. Catherine's a good woman who's had a run of bad luck. But she's my employee. I paid for her train ticket from Helena, gave her room and board. How much does she owe you? Jacob asked bluntly. $20, Rosie replied without hesitation. Plus whatever she might have earned during her recovery time. It was a significant sum, nearly a month's wages for a lumberjack. Jacob thought of the small savings he kept in a tin beneath a floorboard in his cabin. He'd been adding to it for years with no real purpose in mind. If I pay her debt, she's free to leave? He asked. Rosie's eyes widened slightly. You'd do that for a woman you met once? Jacob looked at Catherine's sleeping form. Yes. You're either the kindest man I've met or the biggest fool, Rosie said, shaking her head. But yes, pay her debt and she's free to go. Though where she go is another question entirely. I'll figure that out, Jacob said, more to himself than to Rosie. You're planning to take her to your cabin in the woods? Rosie asked incredulously. An unmarried man and woman living together? That's quite the scandal, even for these parts. Jacob hadn't considered the propriety of his impulsive decision. It would only be until she recovers and decides what she wants to do next. Rosie gave him a knowing look. If you say so. She moved to leave, then turned back. $20, Miller, cash. Then she's all yours, whatever your intentions may be. After Rosie left, Jacob sat in silence, watching Catherine sleep and contemplating the radical change in course his life was about to take. The logical part of him recognized the foolishness of what he was considering. Bringing a stranger, a city woman no less, to his isolated cabin. Yet something deeper, something he thought had died with Sarah, urged him forward. When Catherine stirred again, her eyes seemed clearer, the fever perhaps breaking. You're still here, she murmured, sounding surprised. I'm still here, he confirmed. And I have a proposition for you. A proposition? Catherine repeated warily. Not that kind, Jacob hastened to add. I want to help you leave this place. If you're willing. Catherine struggled to sit up, and Jacob gently helped her, arranging the pillows behind her back. Why would you do that? Because no one did it for me when I needed it most, he answered honestly. And because I think you deserve better than this. Where would I go? Jacob took a deep breath. To my cabin at first. Just until you're well and can decide your next steps. No obligations, no expectations. He felt his face redden slightly. I know how it sounds, but I swear on my wife's memory that my intentions are honorable. Catherine stared at him, searching his face for deception. We barely know each other. True enough, Jacob acknowledged. But sometimes life puts people in our path for a reason. She coughed, the sound rattling in her chest. And if I say no? Then I'll pay for the doctor to come see you here, and I'll be on my way. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers plucking at the worn blanket. People will talk. People always talk, Jacob replied. Especially in small towns with little else to do. But my cabin is far enough away that their voices won't reach us. Another long silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of Catherine's labored breathing. When would we leave? She finally asked. As soon as you're strong enough to travel. A day or two, perhaps. Catherine closed her eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. I never imagined my life taking such a turn. Nor I, Jacob admitted. But here we are. She opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes," she said softly. "Here we are." 2 days later, Jacob's horse pulled the reinforced sled through the snow-covered forest. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long blue shadows across the white landscape. In the sled, Catherine sat bundled in every blanket Jacob and Rosie could find, her face barely visible beneath a woolen scarf. The journey had begun that morning after a brief but intense conversation with Rosie. Jacob had paid the $20, nearly all his savings, and helped Catherine pack her meager belongings. The few other girls at the establishment had watched with expressions ranging from envy to concern as Jacob had carried the still weak Catherine to his waiting sled. "You sure about this, Miller?" Bill had asked as they'd prepared to depart. "Storm's cleared, but it's still mighty cold for traveling, especially with a sick woman." "We'll manage," Jacob had replied, checking the bindings on Catherine's trunk one final time. Now as they traveled deeper into the forest, Jacob glanced back frequently to ensure Catherine was still conscious. Her fever had broken the previous night, but she remained weak, the cough still rattling ominously in her chest. "How much farther?" she called, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Not far now," Jacob assured her. "See that ridge? My cabin sits just below it, protected from the north winds." As they crested a small hill, Jacob's cabin came into view, a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney nestled among towering pines. Smoke curled from the chimney, rising straight into the clear blue sky. Catherine looked confused. "There's smoke. Is someone there?" "I asked Thomas to ride ahead yesterday and light the fire," Jacob explained, "so it would be warm when we arrived." The thoughtfulness of this gesture seemed to touch Catherine deeply. She fell silent as they approached the cabin, her eyes taking in what would be her temporary home. Jacob helped her from the sled, supporting most of her weight as they made their way to the door. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of pine. A single large room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a curtained-off section at the back that presumably contained a bed. "It's not much," Jacob said, suddenly self-conscious about the simplicity of his home. "It's wonderful," Catherine replied sincerely, her eyes taking in the neat, if sparse, furnishings. Jacob guided her to a chair near the fire. "Rest here while I bring in your things and tend to Thunder." By the time Jacob had unhitched the horse, stored Catherine's trunk, and brought in more firewood, the sun had set completely. Through the window, he could see Catherine had dozed off in the chair, her face peaceful in sleep for the first time since he'd known her. He moved quietly around the cabin, preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork. The domestic routine felt strange with another person present, strange, but not unwelcome. When the food was ready, he gently roused Catherine. "You should eat something." She woke slowly, momentarily confused by her surroundings before recognition dawned. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fall asleep." "You need the rest," Jacob assured her, placing a bowl in her hands. "Eat what you can." They dined in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. When Catherine had eaten what she could, Jacob took her bowl. "We should discuss sleeping arrangements," he said, his discomfort with the topic evident. Catherine looked toward the curtained area. "That's your bed, I assume?" "Yes, but you'll take it tonight. I've made a pallet for myself by the fire." She started to protest, but a coughing fit interrupted her. When it subsided, she looked exhausted. "Thank you," she managed. Jacob helped her to the bed, then discreetly stepped outside while she changed into her nightclothes. When he returned, she was already beneath the covers, her clothes neatly folded on a nearby chest. "If you need anything in the night, just call out," he told her. "I'm a light sleeper." "Jacob," she said, using his first name for the first time. "I don't know how to thank you for all this." "No need," he replied. "Get some rest now." As he settled onto his makeshift bed near the fire, Jacob listened to Catherine's breathing gradually even out as she fell asleep. The cabin, so long a place of solitude and memories, felt different with her presence warmer somehow, and not just from the fire. In the days that followed, a routine developed between them. Catherine's health improved steadily, though the cough lingered. She insisted on helping with chores as she regained her strength, proving surprisingly adaptable to cabin life. Jacob taught her to identify different bird calls, how to chop kindling properly, and which local plants could be used for tea. In return, Catherine read aloud from the few books Jacob owned, her voice bringing new life to words he'd read countless times before. They spoke little of the future, both seemingly content to exist in the present moment, a strange limbo between their past lives and whatever might come next. A week after their arrival, Jacob returned from checking his trap lines to find Catherine standing at the kitchen table, kneading dough with flour-covered hands. "What's this?" he asked, removing his snow-covered coat. "I found flour in the pantry," she explained. "I thought bread would make a nice change from biscuits." Jacob watched her work, struck by how natural she looked in his home. "You've done this before," Catherine smiled. "My mother insisted I learn household skills alongside Latin and piano. She said a well-rounded education should include both intellectual and practical knowledge." "Wise woman," Jacob commented, hanging his coat by the door. "She was," Catherine agreed, her hands continuing their rhythmic work on the dough. "She would be shocked to see me now, though living unchaperoned with a man I barely know in the wilderness." There was no judgment in her tone, merely observation, but Jacob felt a twinge of concern. "Does it bother you, being here?" Catherine paused, considering. "Strangely, no. I've never felt safer than I do here with you." She shaped the dough into a loaf and placed it near the fire to rise. "What bothers me is not knowing what comes next." Jacob pulled out a chair and sat at the table. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." "And then what?" Catherine asked, wiping her hands on a cloth. "I have no money, no prospects. I can't impose on your kindness forever." "It's not an imposition," Jacob said quietly. Their eyes met across the table, unspoken possibilities hanging in the air between them. "Jacob," Catherine began carefully, "why did you really bring me here?" He considered the question seriously. "At first, it was simply to help you recover. But now—" He struggled to find the right words. "Now I find I'm glad of your company. The cabin feels more like a home with you in it." Color rose in Catherine's cheeks. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The nearest town with a school is 40 miles away. They might need a teacher." Jacob felt an unexpected pang at the thought of her leaving. "Is that what you want, to teach?" "I don't know what I want anymore," she admitted. "Everything I planned for my life disappeared when Robert died. Since then, I've just been surviving. And now?" Catherine looked around the cabin, her gaze lingering on the simple furnishings, the fire, and finally returning to Jacob. "Now I think I might be ready to start living again." The full meaning behind her words wasn't lost on Jacob. For the first time in 10 years, he found himself considering a future different from the solitary existence he'd chosen after Sarah's death. "Spring will be here soon," he said. "The mountain passes will open. We have time to decide." Catherine nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Time," she repeated. "What a luxury that feels like after everything." Later that evening, as they sat before the fire enjoying fresh bread with the last of Jacob's preserved blueberry jam, Catherine suddenly laughed, a sound Jacob realized he'd never heard from her before. "What's amusing?" he asked, smiling despite himself. "Just thinking about what Rosie would say if she could see me now eating homemade bread in a cabin with the strange lumberjack who paid $5 not to touch me." Jacob chuckled. "I imagine she'd have quite a few choice words." "She told me, before we left," Catherine said, her expression growing more serious, "that you were either the kindest man she'd ever met or the biggest fool." "And what did you think?" Jacob asked. "I thought perhaps you were a bit of both," Catherine admitted. "But I was desperate enough not to question my good fortune too closely." "And now?" Catherine reached across the table and, after a moment's hesitation, placed her hand over his. "Now I think perhaps we were both fortunate that day you walked into Rosie's." Jacob turned his hand to clasp hers, the simple contact more meaningful than any words. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes illuminated by the lights spilling from the cabin windows. But inside, warmth prevailed, not just from the crackling fire, but from the tentative connection forming between two people who had both known profound loss and were, perhaps, finding their way back to life together. "I never expected this," Jacob said softly. "When I paid those $5, all I wanted was conversation." "And now?" Catherine asked, echoing his earlier question. Jacob looked at their joined hands, then up to meet her eyes. Now I think perhaps I was looking for something I didn't know I needed. As was I, Catherine whispered, as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the forest in pristine white. Inside the cabin a new beginning was taking root, unexpected, unplanned, but no less real for all that. Two people, brought together by chance and circumstance, finding in each other not just companionship, but the possibility of healing. "Whatever comes next," Jacob said, "we'll face it together. If that's what you want." Catherine's smile was answer enough.